They said the house had stood since before the Revolution, its bones built from timber felled by the first Sullivans who arrived when Virginia was still wild and unwritten. But no one ever questioned the silence around it. No one dared ask why. The windows were always shuttered from the inside, or why the fields around the estate yielded nothing but dry grass and broken stalks, as if the land itself had turned against the blood that claimed it. It was a place spoken about only in the past tense, like something already dead. And in the spring of 1834, that death began to rot its way to the surface, when 3 families on the northern road began reporting strange sounds drifting through the trees at night. Not the cries of coyotes or foxes, but something softer and more human, thin voices lost in the wind, like the sound of children crying underwater. But when the constable came to investigate, there was nothing to see, just the same broken fences, the same gray porch, the same rusted bell hanging from the post out front. But the air smelled wrong, like iron and mildew, and he noted it, though no one believed him. A week later, a young boy named Thomas Whitlow, age 9, vanished while walking home from school. His lunch tin found at the edge of the Sullivan property. Clean, no sign of struggle, just left there as if placed deliberately, and still no one moved. Not until the night Mrs. Sarah Arliss saw what she swore was a hand reach up from beneath the Sullivan barn floor, pale and thin and shaking like it had forgotten how to be alive. She screamed until her husband ran to the fields, but again there was nothing, just the cold earth and the quiet wind. But the damage had been done. The stories had ignited like dry straw, and for the first time in over 40 years, someone approached. The sheriff with a petition signed by 14 households demanding a search of the Sullivan estate, though even then the sheriff hesitated, because the Sullivans were old land, church land. Their family had paid for the bell in the town chapel. Their patriarch Elias had once baptized half the town's children, and such men were not to be accused lightly. But he went anyway, on a Friday morning, with 3 deputies and a local carpenter to help pry open what no one had ever dared to pry. And they were met at the door by Margaret Sullivan, white-haired and blanketed, who simply stepped aside without a word, and when asked about her husband, she said only that Elias was in prayer, in the basement, and that is when the carpenter, a man named Duncan Hughes, noticed something strange beneath the stairs, a seam in the boards not consistent with the house's original design, as if something had been covered, hidden, sealed. And it took them nearly 2 hours to break through the nails and rotted planks, the wood splintering like bone beneath their crowbars, until finally they reached what could not be denied, a second staircase, leading down into blackness, into a space that should not have existed. They descended with lanterns, the smell hitting them first, a sour blend of filth and old blood and something worse, something human and wrong. And the moment their feet touched the stone floor of the hidden cellar, the light caught eyes, dozens of them, reflecting back like animals caught in the dark. But they were not animals, they were children, or what remained of children. Some curled into corners with chains wrapped so tightly around their ankles that flesh had grown over the links. Others strapped to upright iron poles with leather restraints around their necks and arms. Some in cages barely large enough to kneel. In skin clinging to ribs, mouths swollen shut, eyes that did not blink. 47, the Count would later say, 47 children, the youngest estimated to be 3, the oldest perhaps 11 or 12, though age was nearly impossible to tell through the emaciation. The bruises, the scars. One deputy vomited immediately and collapsed. The carpenter dropped his lantern and had to be restrained from running, and the sheriff himself, a man who had survived war, began to weep. And none of them spoke for nearly 10 minutes as the truth soaked into their bones, that beneath one of the oldest and most respected homes in the county was a tomb, not for the dead, but for the dying, and the sounds they had heard were not stories, but warnings. Each child was chained in a different way, as if the method had been chosen according to some unseen rule. Some were suspended slightly above the ground, with hooks through their clothing. Others laid in rows with ash markings around them, and some, the worst, had their lips stitched halfway closed with coarse black thread, as if silence had been forced upon them with ritual precision. And there were symbols on the walls, burned into the stone with soot and grease, runes no one could read, and circles filled with chicken bones and wax figures. And though no crosses were found, there were pages from Bibles torn and nailed to beams, the words scribbled over in ink and what looked like blood. Not random scribbles, but deliberate changes, verses rewritten, names replaced. They brought the children up one by one, some screaming, some catatonic, and by nightfall the town had gathered outside the Sullivan house in silence, not with pitchforks or torches, but with the kind of quiet that comes when something larger. And anger sets in, something like dread, like the realization that evil had grown in their own soil, watered by their own ignorance. And none of them would ever forget the way the children looked when the lanterns touched their faces, the way the chains dragged behind them like the tails of ghosts. And not one of the townsfolk moved to help until the sheriff ordered it, and even then they obeyed like men under a spell. Margaret was taken into custody, but spoke only nonsense, fragments of scripture mixed with something older, darker. Elias was found later that night, behind a false wall deeper in the basement, kneeling before a pit filled with stagnant water, and holding the body of a child who had already gone cold. And when they tried to pull him away, he bit the deputy's arm and screamed that the boy had not finished his test, that the purification was incomplete, and they had to beat him unconscious before dragging him out into the daylight. And even then he did not stop praying. The house was sealed, boarded, and later burned, but not before investigators spent 3 weeks cataloging everything beneath it: the tools, the restraints, the journals, the drawings, the bones of what appeared to be animals and smaller bones. That did not, and not all of it was taken into evidence. Some of it disappeared, claimed by federal men who arrived unannounced and left just as quickly. And none of the records from those days remain in local archives. The official report lists the incident only as unlawful detainment and abuse, with no mention of ritual. Symbols, no mention of 47 victims, and nothing at all about what Elias called the testing. But the town remembers, and the land remembers. And to this day, no one builds where the Sullivan house once stood. And if you listen at night, they say you can still hear it. Not the cries, but the chains, dragging slowly across stone that should not be there anymore, the sound of something unfinished, something waiting. They did not know how long they had been down there, the children. Some had no memory of light or sky or even language. Their minds were not shaped by love or learning, but by hunger and restraint and the endless scraping of chains against stone. There was no day or night in that place, only the rhythm of footsteps above, the creaking wood of the floorboards, and the occasional voice that filtered through the cracks like a ghost, reminding them that someone else still breathed air that did not stink of rot and urine. Their bodies were small, not because they were young, but because they had stopped growing. Deprived of food and sleep and safety, their bones pushed outward under skin like blades, their bellies distended and tight with starvation. And still they did not cry for help, because help was not a word they understood anymore. Only survival was left, and even that had begun to wear thin. When the investigators brought their lanterns down into the dark, they saw not just the children, but the evidence of a system, a method, a discipline of cruelty so structured and so deliberate that no one could believe it had not been written. Somewhere, codified, passed down like a sacrament. There were markings above each child's face, a symbol or a number, or sometimes both. Carved into the wooden beams with such repetition, it seemed more like categorization than decoration. Each chain was measured to precise lengths, No child could move beyond a circle of dirt that had been scrubbed clean by years of crawling in. That same confined radius, and their eyes, sunken and lifeless, did not register the presence of the rescuers, as though their minds had retreated into some inner fortress where sound and sight no longer mattered. One girl, perhaps 6, perhaps older, had dried blood along the sides of her face and neck, where her ears had been sewn shut with waxed thread. The stitchwork was crude, but purposeful, meant not to heal but to block, to silence the world from entering her mind, and she sat against the far wall, swaying slowly and tapping her fingers in patterns that seemed at first random, but repeated every 23 seconds. The same rhythm, the same beat, and when the physician asked if any of the children had been deafened, he was told not physically, but psychologically. They had not just been confined, but reprogrammed, their senses stripped down and rebuilt by suffering. Some of them were naked, others wore garments fashioned from burlap or stitched together from old curtain fabric, every inch of clothing filthy and damp and crawling with mites. And yet many of the children clutched small objects in their hands, not toys but artifacts, a spoon with no handle, a button, a knotted length of rope, a finger bone carved with runes, items that had no value in the world above, but meant everything down there, talismans of pain and memory, and maybe hope, though. Hope is the wrong word, because what they held was not hope but habit, the routine of possession, of holding on to anything in a place where everything else had been taken from them. One boy, believed to be 9, but so small he resembled a toddler, had his arms bound behind his back with leather straps nailed into the wall, his shoulders dislocated long ago, and he had adapted by using his feet to feed himself, to clean his face, to dig small grooves into the floor that ran in circles like a rat maze. He never blinked, even when the lights were shown directly into his face. And when they tried to cut the straps, he screamed, not in fear but in resistance, as though the release itself was the violation. And it took 3 adults to hold him down before he finally passed out from exhaustion, and the straps, once removed, revealed flesh that had healed over the leather in places, as if his body had tried to absorb its own bondage. There were symbols painted onto the floor in what first appeared to be dried blood, but was later confirmed to be a mixture of animal fat, rust, and crushed bone, a ritual pigment used with precision to create concentric circles and intersecting lines that aligned with the placements of the children, not randomly, but in a deliberate pattern, geometric and tight, a grid of torment designed with mathematical care. One investigator, a former surveyor, said it resembled a mapping system, like a star chart or an architectural plan. And though no one could explain what the symbols meant, the implication was clear. The placement of the children served a purpose beyond containment. They were being held in position for something, as if they were parts of a machine waiting to be activated. Several children had carvings on their bodies, not the result of violence, but of ritual. Precise cuts along the ribs, across the shoulders, behind the knees, areas where nerves cluster. The markings seemed to follow the same sequence on multiple victims, as if someone had learned where to cut to cause the most sustained pain without death. One girl had over 37 such marks on her torso, each one numbered in ink beside it, and the ink had not faded despite the filth, as if the act itself had been preserved by intention or by something else, something that made the pain permanent. One child, described in the reports as entirely feral, could not be approached at all. He was kept in a separate pit dug into the far end of the cellar, surrounded by a crude iron grate, and fed by lowering scraps of raw meat through a slot. His eyes had adjusted so fully to darkness they reflected no light. His fingernails had grown into claws, and his teeth had been filed down to points. Whether by his own hand or another's, no one could say. He snarled and bit at anyone who came near, and when he spoke it was not English, but something else, guttural and rhythmic, a language with no known root. And when an attempt was made to sedate him, He began to chant, a sound that made even the most hardened deputy step back, a low, repetitive drone that echoed through the basement, like the voice of something ancient speaking through a broken mouth. In the western alcove of the basement, covered by a curtain of stitched rags, they found what appeared to be a makeshift altar, low to the ground, built from stacked bricks and a slab of cracked stone. Above it hung a mobile made of teeth, copper wire, and beneath the altar was a shallow basin filled with blackened wax and bone fragments. Small bones, human bones, too small to be from adults. And arranged around the altar were 7 children who had long since stopped breathing, their bodies preserved in salt and ash, their eyes stitched open, staring upward as if to bear witness to whatever ritual had taken place there. And though decomposition had begun, there were no insects, no scavengers, nothing living disturbed the dead in that place. When the children who still breathed were finally removed, it was done not with celebration, but with grim silence, for none of them spoke, none of them reached out. They shuffled into the daylight like sleepwalkers, blinking not in wonder, but in pain, as if the sun itself burned their minds. And every sound above the ground startled them. Birdsong, voices, the creak of wagon wheels, all of it foreign and terrifying. They did not cry, they did not laugh, they simply waited. And even after baths and food and blankets, they did not sleep. They laid with their eyes open, tracking the movement of the moon across the ceiling, as if afraid it would disappear and take them back into the ground. Doctors said their conditions were beyond explanation, that such prolonged confinement should have killed them. And yet they lived, thin but not starved, broken but not bleeding, as if something had kept them alive just enough. And one physician remarked that their wounds, though severe, had all been cleaned and packed, not recently, but regularly, maintained as if by someone who understood the body, but cared nothing for the soul, a caretaker who preserved only what was needed for suffering. To continue, among the recovered items was a ledger, handwritten, with names, dates, and numbers, most of which did not match any local birth or census records. But beside some entries were small notations, words like completed, failed, prepared, and beneath. That a series of numbers written in a sequence that matched the floor diagram of the basement, meaning each child had been catalogued, assigned, tested, and observed, but for what no one could say, because the final pages of the ledger were missing, torn away with such force that fragments of paper were found in the fingernails of one. Of the children who died before rescue, as if they had tried to destroy the record in a final moment of lucidity. Some of the children died in the days following their removal, not from wounds or disease, but from silence. They simply stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped breathing, and when asked why the others gave only one answer, "He is still below." And no amount of explanation or evidence could change that belief. They insisted that something had not been taken from the basement, something still waited beneath, and that until it was fed again, no one was safe, not even them. And one child, a girl with scars in the shape of a cross along her palms and thighs, wrote something before she died, carved into her bedpost with a shard of glass. Not a sentence, but a warning. Stop digging. And that message was enough for the physician to resign, the sheriff to quit, and the house, though burned, was never excavated, never studied, because the fear was not in what they found, but in what they still could not explain. Because what they discovered in that basement was not just cruelty or madness, it was something worse, something intelligent, structured, and ancient, a system of suffering with purpose, a pain that had pattern. And if there was a purpose, then there was a mind behind it. And if there was a mind, then it was still watching, still waiting, still counting, one child at a time. They found diagrams burned into the wooden support beams, with a heated rod shaped like an eye without a pupil, an oval pressed into the grain with perfect spacing between each mark, as though laid out with a compass or by hand, guided through muscle memory, carved by repetition and belief. And when one investigator followed the symbols with chalk, he realized they formed a ring beneath the foundation, not decorative but structural, and where the circles intersected the timber was darker, as if the wood itself had soaked in something older than fire, something sentient, and when those beams were cut, they bled, not sap, but a black substance thick as bile that reeked of iron and salt and mold, and no one could explain how it had formed, or why it never dried. There was something beneath the architecture of the Sullivan estate, not just a basement, but a sublevel, a forgotten crawlspace lined with bricks that bore no mortar, only pressure, and behind those bricks they found hollow chambers too small for a person to enter, yet large enough to hold sound, and when they lowered a recorder into one cavity and played back the tape, they did not hear echoes or rats or insects, but whispers, hundreds of them layered atop one another, like a choir behind a wall, chanting in cadence that repeated every 7 seconds. A cycle so mathematically precise that even the military acoustics specialist brought in from Richmond said it resembled structured communication, not random noise, and though he did not publish his findings, he left town the next morning without collecting his pay. The oldest living relative of the Sullivans, a distant cousin named Edward Thomas, arrived by train after being summoned by letter, and he wept when he saw the estate, not in sorrow but in fear. His hands trembled as he refused to step foot beyond the porch, saying only one phrase in a broken whisper, "They found the doctrine, didn't they?" And when pressed, he collapsed into a seizure that lasted 6 minutes and left him unable to speak again for the rest of his life. And in his suitcase were no clothes but pages of handwritten notes, diagrams, and a weathered book bound in oilskin with no title, only the symbol of the pupilless eye pressed into the leather cover, and pages filled with instructions written in phonetic Latin, Old French, and what appeared to be reversed English, each page ending with the same word underlined 3 times, completion. That book, which came to be called the Sullivan Doctrine, detailed rituals not of worship but of extraction, processes designed to reduce the human will to ash and rebuild it as a conduit for external direction. It was not about belief but surrender, not prayer but programming, and it outlined in obsessive detail how to isolate a subject, remove identity, create dependency through deprivation, and reintroduce meaning through pain, language through obedience, touch through reward, and when, compared with the behavior of the children found beneath the estate, every step aligned. Even the patterns of rocking, the symbols carved into bone, the timing of meals and light and sleep, all of it matched as if someone had followed this doctrine word for word, and when asked who wrote it, the final page offered a single answer scrawled in a frantic hand, the mouth below. There were journals found hidden inside the walls, wrapped in pigskin and sealed with wax, each belonging to a different Sullivan and dated from 1791 to 1834, and every journal chronicled the same transformation, a slow descent from religious idealism into something deeper, something darker, phrases like illumination through stillness, purity through suffering, and the quiet language of the dark place appeared again and again, and in several entries the authors described hearing instructions in their sleep, not dreams but commands, delivered in a voice that came from the floorboards, and sometimes from the mouths of the children themselves, as if their suffering had thinned the veil between thoughts and command, and they had become receivers not of God's voice, but something else that had learned how to mimic mercy while hiding malice in its rhythm. The builders of the house had not been carpenters, but masons brought from overseas, men paid in gold and sworn to secrecy, and in the foundation stones were found carvings consistent with pre-Christian European cults, sigils meant to bind, to harness, to seal. And when a local historian compared them to Iberian grave markings, he noted that some were intended not to protect the living from spirits, but to protect the spirits from escape, as if the structure itself was not a house, but a container, a lid, pressed onto a boiling pot, And when asked what kind of entity would require such containment, he simply shook his head and refused to return to the site. When they reopened the well behind the estate, dry since 1812, they found it was not dry but sealed, the stones beneath removed with precision and replaced with a grate of forged iron etched with Latin commands. Tuus est sanguis, claudere portum, expecto mortem. Your blood is mine, close the gate. I wait for death. And beneath that grate was a second chamber flooded, not with water, but with air thick as syrup, where candles would not light and voices echoed wrong, delayed and overlapping, as if repeated by another mouth deeper down. And when they lowered a rope, no one returned from that descent. Not the sheriff's deputy, not the doctor's assistant, not the boy who snuck in that night to prove his courage and was never seen again. Inside the doctrine was a map not of land, but of memory, a diagram of human thought reduced to 7 chambers, each named not by function, but by failure, denial, submission, hunger, silence, confusion, obedience, null, and the instructions beside. Each were not philosophical, but surgical. Where to press, where to cut, where to speak, and when to withhold breath, and those who followed it, according to the notes, would become voices of the quiet law, vessels through which commands could be passed without sound, and if successful, the vessel would be able to listen even through walls, even through death, and still obey. One passage read, begin not with birth, but with subtraction. Strip the child of identity, remove the name, remove the lineage, remove the mirror, and in absence create the perfect shape for containment. And when the investigators reviewed the names of the children recovered, they realized none had surnames recorded. None had documents. None had surviving kin. They had all been erased before being bound. They were not just victims, but materials, hollowed out and used to build something else, something less than human and more than obedient. One body found in the farthest corner of the basement had not decayed, though he had clearly been dead for years. His skin was gray and taut, his eyes open and clear, and in his chest was a small cavity filled with rolled parchment soaked in wax, and when removed it disintegrated, but not before revealing a single phrase etched into the container. He speaks through silence, and silence spreads, and the man's jaw, though rotted, had been dislocated not from trauma, but from overextension, as if opened beyond the limit of human anatomy, as if something had spoken through him that did not need lungs or breath, only bone and flesh and direction. The children who survived later reported dreams not of escape, but of return, recurring nightmares where they stood at the edge of the stairs and felt themselves pulled down by invisible hands, not violent but insistent, and they all described hearing the same word repeated beneath the floorboards of their new homes. Home, spoken not with affection but with hunger, and several were institutionalized within months, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, drawing the eye symbol again and again on walls, tables, even their own skin, as if marking themselves to be found again, to be reclaimed. No explanation was ever given by the courts. The case was sealed, the house condemned, and the land sold to a private buyer who built a church on the ruins, a church that has since been abandoned after parishioners reported hearing voices during Mass, the sound of children crying beneath the pews, and blood appearing in the holy water when the priest recited the Lord's Prayer backward by accident during a funeral. What the Sullivans built was not a family home, but a mechanism, a chamber for obedience, a doctrine made flesh and mortar, and the children were not prisoners, but instruments, each one tuned to a frequency that has not stopped resonating even now. And if that frequency is ever heard again in full, if someone ever finds the rest of the doctrine and completes the last ritual, the mouth will open again, not metaphorically, but literally, because beneath Virginia's soil, beneath the ruins and the stone and the shame, there is still a hunger waiting, not for flesh, but for silence so deep and obedient that it can be shaped into anything. He was not a man prone to fantasy or fear or exaggeration. His name was Jacob Harrow, a veteran of the War of 1812 and a groundskeeper by trade who took the job at the Sullivan estate in 1831 after the previous caretaker vanished without resignation. Or notice leaving behind only a boot near the edge of the eastern ravine and a small coil of rope soaked in something too dark to be mud. Jacob had seen war, had seen men torn open by cannon, had seen whole towns emptied of boys who would never return, but what he witnessed under that house was something no war could prepare a man for. He first heard the sound in his second month, working there, a low rhythm like a heartbeat, coming not from the walls of the woods, but from directly beneath the soil near the rear edge of the property, where the land sloped down into a gully that stayed unnaturally cold even in July, and the air above it trembled faintly as if the heat itself avoided that place. And when he placed his hand on the ground to listen, he felt not vibration, but breath, slow, steady breath exhaling upward from the earth itself. And he stood too quickly, lost his balance, and fell back, and when he looked again, the soil was undisturbed, not a ripple, not a leaf misplaced, but something had changed. He could feel it in his chest, like something inside him had listened back. He told no one, not even the stable boy who was the only other person allowed on the estate after dark, and when he mentioned the sound to one of the Sullivan daughters, a pale child with blackened fingernails and lips that never smiled, she only tilted her head and whispered, "You're hearing the old one, aren't you?" and then walked away laughing, though her mouth never moved. And Jacob tried to convince himself it was stress or wind or imagination until the night he followed the master of the house down into the second basement, the one hidden behind a false panel beneath the wine racks marked only with an iron ring bolted into stone. The passage was tight, the walls narrowed the deeper they went, and the air became dry and metallic and smelled like a room that had once held too many bodies for too long. And when they reached the bottom, Jacob saw not a storage room, but a chamber with no purpose. He could recognize a place with no furniture, no tools, no bedding, just a circular room with soot-stained walls and symbols carved into the stone too deep to have been done by hand. And there were voices there, not loud, not clear, but present, soft as breath. And when he turned to ask Mr. Sullivan what the room was for, he found the man standing perfectly still, his eyes closed, his mouth moving silently. And when Jacob touched his arm, the man opened his eyes and said only one thing: "This is where we become obedient." That night, Jacob packed to leave, but was stopped by one of the Sullivan sons, a boy named Elijah, who was 12 but carried himself like a man twice his age, and who spoke with a confidence that chilled the air around him. And Elijah told Jacob that if he left the estate, his blood would speak through the soil for years, that no one would hear it, but it would echo still. And Jacob laughed until he saw the boy's eyes shift, not in light, but in shape, as though his pupils had split into vertical slits for a fraction of a second, and then returned, and Jacob said nothing more and stayed. He stayed for 2 more years, and in that time he saw changes in the family. They began to walk barefoot, even in winter, and refused to eat during the day. And he noticed that none of the children cast shadows in candlelight, though they did in sunlight, and that sometimes their voices did not come from their mouths, but from the corners of rooms they hadn't entered yet. And once, while trimming the hedges, he found a bone buried in the garden, too small to be animal, too clean to be accidental. And when he brought it to the matriarch, she smiled and said they were returning what was borrowed. The children would disappear for days at a time, and return emaciated, silent, eyes wide, and skin marked with what looked like language symbols he could not decipher, carved into their backs with what must have been knives, but healed too quickly to be normal. And once he followed them down into the crawl space where they vanished, and found not a tunnel, but a door made of wood that pulsed faintly like a throat swallowing. And when he touched it, he heard a voice not aloud, but behind his eyes, saying, "We are always becoming," and the door opened by itself, but he did not go through. He began to hear music in his sleep, not melody, but a rhythm, like water dripping in reverse, and once he woke to find himself standing at the edge of the basement stairs with mud on his feet, and no memory of leaving bed. And when he checked his journal the next day, he found pages filled with handwriting, not his own scrawled diagrams, and the same phrase written over and over in trembling ink through flesh: "We bind through silence we hold." One night in the fall of 1833, he found the children standing in a circle in the main hall, their eyes closed, their mouths stitched shut with black thread, and when he tried to speak, he found he could not, his throat constricted, and his limbs froze. And the children began to hum not with their mouths, but through the floor itself, and the walls shook gently, and a light bloomed from beneath the floorboards, not red, but the color of rot. And when it stopped, they opened their eyes, and the thread was gone, and none of them bled. He left the next day, walked barefoot for 17 miles to the nearest parish, and collapsed on the steps, and when the priest came out to help him, he said only one sentence before losing consciousness: "They are trying to build a silence that obeys." And when he woke, he had no memory of the past year, only flashes of symbols, voices, darkness, and the sensation of drowning in still air. Jacob Harrow died in 1835 in a sanitarium outside Roanoke, and his final drawings, made in charcoal on the walls of his cell, showed a mouth with no teeth, a throat that descended into spiral staircases, and beneath it all a pit filled with children, standing still, staring upward, their mouths open, not screaming, but waiting for a command, waiting for someone to finish what had begun. The aftermath of the rescue, but what they did not reckon was how the silence descended like a blanket over every witness. Once the children were gone, commissars of memory were deployed, not openly, but through veiled threats, obscured records missing. Archives' entire pages burned or stolen. When the investigators handed over their notes to county clerks, they found the binders replaced with blank folios overnight, and the official account reduced the incident to unlawful detainment, yet hospitals reported at least 17 survivors who died after removal from the cellar, not from wounds, but from silence collapsing into walls. Until they stopped speaking and stopped breathing, one timid girl carved her name into a board: Lydia No Name. Though that was not her name, but whatever name had been given above ground, none used it. She refused food and water for 4 days, claiming he is still down there, and until he eats again. "I cannot be well," 15 state workers and a physician signed sworn statements affirming they heard her speak it verbatim, yet the records vanished from the archives, and the hospital log listed her death as consumption of the lungs, not starvation or refusal, and later her body disappeared from the mortuary. Before relatives could claim it, 2 investigators were warned by a man in black gloves saying, "Forget this, or you will join them beneath the floor." The other investigator reported vague threats in his journal, but when the journal was rediscovered 50 years later, entries past the warning were scratched out as if clawed by panic itself. There was talk of burning the journals within days, but someone smuggled them to a museum in Richmond, where they stayed unseen until Donner's death in 1922, when most were discarded as indecipherable gibberish. Yet some pages survived, showing child sketches of circles, and the I symbol repeated over and over with childish spelling, "Ilestone," underlined again and again. The county judge who issued the suppression order was buried 9 months later under mysterious circumstances. Official cause: heart failure, yet acquaintances claimed he left the bench rattled, obsessed, speaking in his sleep about chains and voices beneath, and the federal agents who arrived to collect evidence. They never presented any warrant, only loaded dozens of crates into wagons and hauled them away. At dawn, witnesses said they saw gloved hands carry a small bound figure wrapped in burlap into one crate and seal it tight. They never said where those crates went, and some local lore suggests they were shipped northward to Baltimore or even Washington, yet requests to search. Military records yielded nothing responses, stating we have no record of such shipment and nothing held at our facility matching description, at least one. Academic wrote a paper in the 1970s about the Sullivan case, quoting unpublished testimonies of survivors, yet the university was sued for defamation by anonymous plaintiffs. Claiming libelous fiction, the paper was retracted. The author resigned and disappeared from public view newspapers that attempted to publish feature stories in the late 1800s were sued or their printing plates destroyed by fire, one publisher swore. He was offered a bribe by a man who slid a coin purse across the desk, smiling with empty eyes and saying some stones are better left unturned. Diaries from townsfolk mention nights when they heard chains dragging across empty stone floors long after the house burned. Diaries sealed in time capsules were found during renovations. Many entries redacted in ink after they were sealed. Townsfolk interviews in the 1940s spoke of children who vanished without trace from neighboring counties, matching age and description to those found chained. One woman claimed her younger sister disappeared at age 5 in 1832, and years later, Lydia No Name whispered her name in a dream and then vanished from the asylum. A researcher found anthropological notes referencing bone fragments matching children's size beneath church foundation east of the original estate, yet excavations were blocked by church orders citing sacred ground, but no archaeological survey permissions granted. There was talk of eminent domain, yet the parish sued, claiming historical harm to faith, and eventually the site was left untouched, though the foundation beneath is rumored still hollow, and silent residents say the ground trembles once a year on the anniversary of the discovery, though local geologists found no seismic activity. Maps from 1834 show no sinkhole or cavern, but modern sonar surveys reveal voids beneath the property, beneath the church, beneath the soil, ancient hollows shaped too regular to be natural, yet digging is forbidden. No permit granted, no explanation given. When a news crew tried to film from the air, their footage was confiscated. They were told federal investigators claimed operations still active. Public safety unknown risk. Classified survivors who lived into adulthood refused interviews. Many checked into asylums or innately erased from records. Surnames, missing locations unknown, yet several letters were later found in private archives from someone calling himself the Silent Keeper, claiming responsibility for safeguarding the basement and preventing those children from being spoken for again. He wrote one line repeatedly: never fill the mouth with words, lest it open the door where their keeper was Sullivan descendant. Or something older no one knows. And the final page of one journal fragment provided a drawing of a door beneath the well grate, but not just a door, a mouth carved in stone with rows of teeth and a tongue of brick, a tongue that seemed to pulse. According to testimony from the acoustic specialist, when he recorded sound in the crawl spaces, a pulse matching heartbeat at 57 seconds per cycle, the same rhythm embedded in the ledger sequences. One child tapped her fingers at that rate. The sturdy lock of the basin door disappeared years ago. Overnight, one night, the villagers say there was a scraping sound beneath the soil that went on for hours, a slow metallic rasp, key or blade against link, and next morning the grate over. The well was intact, but the soil around it had settled as if something had been shifted, locked, or awakened. Nobody dared investigate, and the landowner, who had bought the site, sold it again at a loss, claiming bad memories weigh heavier than taxes. Each new owner refused to speak of its surveyors, refused to walk. The property workers fell ill when they stayed overnight. Guests who slept near the ruins claimed nightmares of chains, voices, symbols dancing in darkness, and one child visitor woke screaming, "He called my name from below," and the family left that night, no explanation. There were markings on the stone that no preacher could explain and no historian could trace. Symbols etched into the limestone with fingers worn down to bone, blood seeping into the porous wall like ink into parchment, spirals that circled outward from the lowest beam of the Sullivan basement, converging on a crude altar of ash and split bone. And though the official report stated no religious artifacts were found, those who stood down there and smelled the burnt hair and iron-sweet rot told a different story in hushed voices and sleepless nights, because what was seen beneath that house had nothing to do with Christianity or any faith practiced in daylight. No, this was something older, something that did not want prayers but silence, obedience, sacrifice. The shape of the room itself was wrong, not square but pentagonal, with each corner carved deeper than the last, a funnel pulling sound and warmth downward into something that felt alive. Investigators said their compasses spun uselessly when, set upon the altar, their watches stopped ticking entirely, and some claimed to hear breathing from beneath the floorboards, slow and rhythmic like an animal dreaming in dirt, or something pretending to sleep. And what disturbed them more than anything was that the children never made a sound when they were brought near that corner. Not a cry, not a whisper, just wide eyes and twitching fingers. A pattern emerged in the drawings on the walls, scratched by the same desperate hands that had scrawled verses in broken Latin and something else. A language that curled back in on itself, with looping characters and vertical lines that resembled trees without leaves, symbols that did not match any script in the region's archives. And when scholars decades later were shown the copied fragments, a few stepped away from the table and refused to speak again. One reportedly collapsed shaking, muttering a phrase again and again: "The covenant below, the covenant below, the covenant below." One burned fragment of a journal recovered from beneath a pile of collapsed timber bore a title, nearly lost to the flames, but partially legible: "Doctrine of Descent," and within it a single sentence was underlined repeatedly in what appeared to be a child's blood: "Suffering is the staircase, and through its pain we ascend to favor of the eater." A line so incomprehensibly twisted in logic that no theologian dared claim ownership of its origin. And yet, when compared to recovered testimonies from the older children who could still form sentences, the phrase appeared again and again in different forms. The eater waits, the eater sleeps beneath. We are made thin so we can fit into the mouth of God. The eater, they said, was not a monster in the traditional sense. No claws, no fangs, no roaring from the dark, but a presence, an absence that devoured meaning and memory. A void beneath the Sullivan estate that drank light and spat out obedience. And some speculated that Elias Sullivan had not created the basement, but found it, that the foundation had been built atop something ancient, something that had whispered to him in the silence of Margaret's miscarriages, that he had stood on that cold stone and heard a voice that told him how to be forgiven, how to fill the house with children, how to make his bloodline clean again. One investigator, a Methodist chaplain named Horace Bleachley, wrote a final report before vanishing on his return to Richmond, a document never entered into evidence, but later discovered in a trunk belonging to his widow. And in it he detailed a ritual site beneath the known basement, accessed only by crawling through a narrow hole hidden behind a rotting wardrobe, a space so small only a child could fit, and inside it he found a circle of burnt hair, rusted nails, driven into dolls made from animal skin, and an effigy of a figure kneeling on no legs, its head turned backward, mouth stretched into a permanent scream. And he wrote plainly, "If they did this to keep it sleeping, I fear it now dreams of hunger." The church's refusal to address these findings only deepened the mystery, because when asked about the script on the walls, the inverted verses, the desecrated psalms written in a child's unsteady hand, they offered only deflections, claiming such things were the work of trauma and hysteria, not spiritual corruption. Yet privately, several church archivists were said to have requested access to the site before its destruction, and though no official visit was recorded, one of them, Father Ambrose Kernay resigned his post within a month, citing an overwhelming presence of shadow and refusing to speak another word until his death in 1842, during which he reportedly carved something into the underside of his bedframe using his own fingernails. Do not pray below. Elias Sullivan's own sermons, those that survived, hinted at something beyond redemption, language that grew steadily more cryptic as the years progressed, references to the trials of bone, the feast of purity, and the filtration of sign through. The unformed, and in one particularly unsettling passage, dated 3 years before the discovery, he wrote, "Children are closer to the mouth of the beginning. Their screams are more nutritious to the hungering God, and in their thinning the veil opens." What veil he meant no one could agree on, but those familiar with Appalachian folklore noted similarities to the thin times, periods when the natural and unnatural brush against each other like cold fingers beneath a locked door, and the Sullivan. Land perched atop a strange geological fault, and rumored burial ground was one of those places. Older folk said dogs never howled there. They whimpered and fled. The trees bent away from the Fairmouse, as if repelled, not by weather, but by something below that pulled and pulsed and whispered in sleep. There was no record of the symbols in any local native traditions. Yet some elders, when shown sketches, turned away in disgust, muttering about starving stones and black mouths in the dirt, insisting their ancestors avoided those hills long before. Colonists built their homesteads, and one went so far as to say the Sullivan House was a second planting, a place where the first settlers had buried not their dead, but something worse, something that could not be killed, only fed slowly until it fell back into its dreaming. The final artifact removed from the basement before its destruction was a small wooden box found beneath a loose stone slab, carved with alternating faces of saints and screaming infants, and inside it were 32 teeth, human, each filed to a needle point and strung together on what appeared to be a braid of human hair, wrapped around a tiny leather-bound book no larger than a man's palm, the title pressed in gold leaf read simply, "Offerings," and its pages were filled with rituals of purification that involved silence, confinement, starvation, and finally, acceptance into the eater's truth. The state deemed the contents inadmissible, citing lack of clear evidence and mental instability among witnesses, yet the box was never catalogued, and when archivists later searched for it, no record of its existence remained beyond a single line in a requisition form marked Classified Ecclesiastical Division. Even now, in private collections and whispered circles of occult scholars, references to the Sullivan rites persist, though no one dares claim knowledge beyond fragments, and those who pursue it too far often disappear from public life, reappearing only in rambling letters or half-burned notebooks mailed from nowhere, warning of doors beneath homes, voices in the floorboards, children who do not sleep but wait because the truth was never buried, only hidden, and hunger, as they say, has a long memory. So what was the Sullivan basement, really? A prison? A ritual chamber? A feeding ground for a god that no longer fits into our clean categories of evil and divine? Or was it something worse? A mirror reflecting the darkest urges of a man dressed in righteousness, a preacher so hollowed out by grief and obsession that he became the mouth through which something older could speak once more. And if the latter is true, then the real horror is not what was found below, but what remains above, in every town where silence covers absence, in every church that hides history beneath charity, in every child who disappears without a sound. Because maybe Elias Sullivan was not the first, and he was certainly not the last. They never told the public what the children drew in the weeks after their rescue, not because the drawings were graphic, not because they depicted suffering, but because the images were too consistent, too aligned, too exact across children who had never spoken to each other and barely remembered their names. Each sketch showed a great black circle in the floor, always surrounded by jagged white lines like broken teeth or splintered bones, and always with something rising from its center, a long thing, not quite a figure, not quite a shadow, just a shape too narrow and tall to be human and too symmetrical to be natural. And in every drawing, without exception, the same phrase was written in the corner in shaky childish script. It watches when you forget its name. Doctors thought it was collective trauma, the mind finding patterns in chaos. But one nurse wrote that she overheard one of the younger children whisper to her reflection in a window late one night, whispering not in English, but in that same strange language found on the basement walls, a tongue that had no phonetic equivalent, but bled from the mouth like rot from a wound, a language that made her teeth ache and her nose bleed just from listening. And when she reported it to the lead physician, he told her never to mention it again. Ben locked himself in his office for 3 days and emerged looking 20 years older with a single phrase scrawled across every page of his notebook. It is not a voice, it is a hunger. There were rumors the children were tested secretly, not just for disease or mental damage, but for something deeper, something spectral, some unnatural residue left inside them. And according to one declassified report, leaked decades later, a pattern was found in their sleep rhythms. All 47 of them had identical cycles of REM and non-REM states. Their heart rates peaked at precisely the same times during the night. And worst of all, every one of them screamed at 3:12 a.m. every night for 3 weeks straight, even when sedated, even when isolated in soundproof rooms with no clocks and no windows, as if something inside them remembered when it was supposed to cry out. Some investigators began to believe that what was buried beneath the Sullivan estate was not a creature but a wound, not a place you could map, but a tear in the structure of reality itself, a pocket of hunger that did not belong in the physical world but had been given shape by faith, repetition, and ritual. That Elias Sullivan hadn't summoned anything new. He had only fed what was already there, fed it with fear, isolation, and the pure, undiluted suffering of the young, not to serve it, but to become part of it, and in some way, according to one theory, to vanish into it completely. Because what they never could explain, what they buried deeper than the official records, was that Elias Sullivan's body was never found, not in the house, not in the woods, not in the surrounding counties, not anywhere. And yet, one of the children claimed he still came to them, not in dreams, but through walls, through mirrors, through shadows cast by nothing. And when they drew him, he was no longer a man. His eyes had turned to polished stone. His mouth had no end, stretching past his chin, past his chest, down into a black place where skin and bone lost meaning, and his fingers were too long, too many, always reaching, always beckoning. One boy David told drew a map from memory, a map of tunnels beneath the basement that no one had shown him, tunnels the work crews swore did not exist. Yet when a team of contractors was sent to demolish the foundation years later, they broke through a false floor and discovered a hollow space beneath, not a room, but a corridor that sloped downward in impossible geometry, where walls seemed to pulse slightly with heat and breath. And at the end of that passage, they found a door, not made of wood or metal, but of something soft and fibrous, something that shivered when touched and pulsed like a heart. A door that would not open and had no lock, only a faint carving above it that translated roughly to "you are already inside." The crew refused to continue, and 2 of them quit construction entirely. One of them, Hiram Watts, desappered 3 days later, last seen pacing outside the ruins of the estate with a shovel and a look on his face like something had hollowed him out and was now wearing his skin as a coat. And when his family cleaned out his belongings, they found a notebook under his floorboards filled with drawings of a tall thing, a thin thing, the same shape the children had drawn, but with new detail eyes all over its body, mouths where its joints should be, and legs that bent the wrong way like broken promises. The government quietly seized the property soon after, citing safety concerns, and poured concrete over the remaining foundation. But concrete cracks, concrete wears, and beneath that thick gray skin the old stone still breathes, still whispers. Through the cracks, and people who walk near the old site say their dreams feel heavier after, like something followed them home and waits in the corners of their bedroom when they turn off the lights. Not watching, but listening, measuring, remembering. What frightened the surviving nurses the most, long after they left their posts and tried to forget, was not what the children said, but what they stopped saying. How one by one they fell silent, not from trauma, but from obedience, as if some unseen hand had laid a finger on their lips and reminded them of a promise they were never supposed to break. And in one final Cassia girl named Clara Mosser, silence lasted 12 years, until she was found dead in her apartment with the words, "He still walks the halls beneath," carved into her kitchen table in her own fingernails. No one claims responsibility for covering up the rest. No one admits who classified the records or burned the journals. But records don't vanish on their own. Photos don't blur themselves. And basements don't disappear from blueprints without someone making that choice, someone with knowledge, someone with fear, someone who maybe heard the voice too, faintly, when reviewing the evidence alone at night, that long whisper asking a single question over and over. What did they feed me? Before they fed me themselves? So tell me, how deep does silence go? What do we bury when we call it madness? What do we forget when it stares at us from the cracks in old wood? Was Elias Sullivan a madman, or was he simply the first one to listen fully? And if so, how many more have listened since? The last person to speak publicly about the Sullivan case was an archivist named Thomas Greer, a quiet man in his 60s who had worked in the State Records Department for 37 years, and who, by accident or design, came across a sealed folder marked not by title, but by a hand-drawn circle with jagged white lines etched into the paper. Inside were photographs that should not have existed. Photos of the children weeks before discovery, taken in dim orange light with symbols on the walls behind them that bled at the edges as if the ink had never dried. Photos that included a figure in the background of each frame, tall, thin, featureless, and impossibly still. Greer tried to file a report, but his superiors told him the file was never logged, the case never recorded, and the folder he held had never existed. And when he returned home that evening, he found every photograph replaced with blank sheets, every page of his notes shredded inside the drawer he had locked, and his dog, a gentle old retriever named Amos, staring into the basement and growling at nothing, low and shaking as if something behind the wall had begun to breathe louder than it should. 3 weeks later, Greer vanished from his home, leaving behind only one note written in trembling ink on the back of a church bulletin. He waits for names to be forgotten, because names are the last thing that keeps him out. That same week, strange readings were detected beneath the concrete slab that now covers the Sullivan Foundation. Seismic pulses too regular to be tectonic, almost like a rhythm, and local animals began to vanish. First cats and then birds, until even the deer stopped crossing the nearby woods, and hunters reported hearing what they called childlike howls rising from beneath the earth, but not made of pain, not made of fear, something else entirely, like joy twisted inside out. A priest who had served at the original church Elias Sullivan once attended confessed on his deathbed that the congregation had known something was wrong long before the authorities acted, that they had seen the children once, walking silently behind Elias in the woods at night in perfect formation, barefoot, eyes open but not blinking, hands clasped as if in prayer to something older than language, and that no matter how many times they asked where the children came from, he only said, "From under where the white roots burn." No record survives of where the bodies of the dead were buried. No monument was ever raised for the victims. And even the names of the 47 children have been redacted in most public records, replaced by initials or simply erased, not by accident, but as if forgetting them was part of the ritual, part of the price paid for silence. And yet, in private collections, in hidden rooms behind university libraries, and inside the basements of shuttered churches, old pages still whisper. Pages that claim Elias Sullivan was not acting alone, that his family had kept the tradition alive for generations, and that before the basement ever held chains, it held something far older. A stone, or a heart, or a gate, the stories differ. But always it was described the same way, circular, black, warm to the touch, even in winter. And when touched, it would whisper back. Never words, never sentences, just impressions, tastes, memories that were not your own, and promises, always promises, that if you fed it the forgotten, it would make you more than flesh, that if you gave it the hidden, it would make you louder than death. Some say Elias never died, that he became something else, something that moves in the dark between memories and dreams, something that cannot be seen but can be heard in the stillness between waking and sleep, and that those who listen too long will wake with dirt under their fingernails and the scent of stone dust in their lungs. And when they speak, they will not remember what they said, but others will weep without knowing why. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, children who live near the old Sullivan estate still speak of the black man with the long hands, not as a story, but as a visitor, a tall man who stands at the foot of their beds and asks if they remember their names, and if they do not, he whispers one into their ear, a new name, a black name, a name that when spoken out loud makes the lights flicker and the mirrors turn dark. There are those who believe the truth was buried too late, that what grew in the Sullivan basement was never just evil but a seed, and the 47 were not victims, but vessels, scattered and raised in different parts of the country like spores, each carrying a piece of that voice in their blood. And some say their descendants still live, still feel the pull of that rhythm under the ground, still hear the hunger that was never sated. And on those rare nights when the wind is too still and the ground too warm, when silence spreads across the old woods and the moonlight bends in unnatural shapes, people say you can still hear the sound of chains shifting, not in pain, not in fear, but in preparation. Because what was opened in that basement was not a prison, it was a nursery. And what was fed, there was not a god, not a demon, not a ghost, but something else, something that remembers, something that waits, something that has never stopped, listening. And now you know why the Sullivan family was erased. Now you understand why they sealed the truth under concrete and called it legend. Because if you ever speak of it too clearly, if you ever name it with certainty, it remembers you. Back, and once it remembers you, it never forgets. Now close your eyes and tell me, do you remember your name?